And this structure here, this horn shaped structure that we see here, this one is a bone and this is hyoid bone. Hyoid, which is also called the tongue bone because it supports the tongue muscle. The tongue muscles are attached to this hyoid. So this is how the structure of the larynx is, and in this we can see that in the anterior view there would be this thyroid cartilage which is projecting out because of the notch, and behind this thyroid there would be arytenoid, and above it, it is the epiglottis which will be covering. Now if we see the interior of this larynx, what we will find is that there is a mucous membrane lining it, and that mucous membrane is forming two pairs of folds. One which is superior, that is above, and that one is the false vocal cords. That means they are not involved in producing sound, while the inferior pair is called the true vocal cords. These are the ones which are covered with pseudostratified epithelium, and within it there are elastic cords which are basically ligaments, and these can vibrate. These can vibrate just like the strings of a guitar, and sound originates from the vibrations of this vocal cord. The production of sound, of course, is called phonation. Now these vocal cords, they, in case of females and children, in females and children, and when I use the term children, that means before puberty, whether boys or girls, both of them, in them these vocal cords, that is true vocal cords, are thin and short. Now for sound, there are some basic properties that we use the terms, and that is pitch, which is related to frequency. That means how many times the cord vibrates, and sound is produced when we exhale. That means when we are exhaling out, at that time the sound would be produced. So how many times it is vibrating, that would be the pitch, and such cords which are thin and short, the pitch is high. So that means there will be high frequency sound produced in case of females and children, or in other words we can say the sound is shrill. Then there is another thing, that is loudness, and loudness depends on amplitude. That means how much displacement is caused in the cord when the air passes, and here the amplitude is less. Pitch is high but amplitude or loudness is less. Now in case of male children, at the time of puberty, when the sex organs, that is testes, becomes functional and starts secreting testosterone. So this testosterone has major role in the body, other than making the secondary sexual structures being developed. It also has an effect on the vocal cords. So as a result, the vocal cords become thick and long. So this again we can mention in males, vocal cords are thick and long, and this changeover has been brought about by testosterone, the male sex hormone, and as a result now what happens, there is a change in the voice. The pitch becomes low but amplitude becomes high. So there is, the sound produced is having low pitch and high amplitude. Now from larynx, moving on to next part, that is the trachea. Trachea or the windpipe. Now this is a tubular passageway, of course, for air. This is the length and the diameter given. Now it is located anterior to the esophagus. That means in the front of the neck there would be trachea, and behind it there is the esophagus. And it extends from the larynx, that is from the bottom part of the larynx, to the fifth thoracic vertebra. Now what in our vertebral column we have number of vertebrae, 7 of them in the cervical area, and then in our thoracic area there are 12 vertebrae. So at the fifth thoracic vertebra, at that level, the trachea divides into 2, and those divisions are called the bronchi. So there would be one right bronchus leading into the right lung and left bronchus leading into the left lung. And the inner lining of trachea, the mucosa, again that is called mucosa. Mucosa, or the inner lining of the trachea, it consists of an epithelial layer which is having ciliated pseudo-stratified epithelium with number of goblet cells. That means mucus secreting cells are present. And outer to this epithelium there are C-shaped rings which are made up of hyaline cartilage, and because of these rings the tracheal wall is non-collapsible. That means it will, when air we are exhaling out, the air pressure is less, then also the tracheal wall will remain intact. It will not collapse, and this is one very important part which maintains the structure. And when we talk about the C-shaped rings, so these rings, they are complete having ciliated pseudo-stratified epithelium with number of goblet cells. That means mucus secreting cells are present. And outer to this epithelium there are C-shaped rings which are made up of hyaline cartilage, and because of these rings the tracheal wall is non-collapsible. That means it will, when air we are exhaling out, the air pressure is less, then also the tracheal wall will remain intact. It will not collapse, and this is one very important part which maintains the structure. And when we talk about the C-shaped rings, so these rings, they are complete on the anterior side, and the side which is incomplete will be towards the esophagus, so that when we are ingesting the food, that food, because of peristalsis, when the esophagus bulges, still it will not be affecting the trachea. Now let us see the structure of trachea. So here we can see this is the larynx, and the bottom of the larynx, this is leading into the trachea, where we can see these cartilage rings are present. And here, as we said, at the fifth thoracic vertebra, which we can mention as T5, at this T5 it is branching out into 2, and these 2 branches are the primary bronchi. And once these primary bronchi enter into the lungs, they will further divide into number of, means secondary, tertiary, and then finally forming the bronchioles, which will be ultimately ending with the alveoli, which structures will be soon be studying. Now before going any further, let us take a question. Now pitch of the voice is lower in males than in females, as the vocal cords of man are. Now vocal cords of the man, because of the effect of testosterone, they are thick and long. So here answer 1 is the correct answer. Now let's move ahead with the rest of the part of the respiratory system. The next part of the respiratory tract are the bronchi. Now the trachea divides into the right bronchus, which enters the right lung, and the left bronchus, which enters the left lung. And each bronchus, once it has entered into the lung, it divides further to form secondary bronchi, which will divide to form tertiary bronchi, and so on. And there would be extensive branching, which is then called the bronchial tree. Some of the tracts formed by the bronchial tree that we will be mentioning when we discuss about the respiratory pathway. For the time being, first of all, however, we will take the lungs. Now the lungs are paired structures, cone shaped, and they are present inside the airtight thoracic cavity. So our thoracic cavity, that is the chest cavity, is airtight. That means air from outside cannot enter into the chest cavity. Rather, the air which we inhale in, that will be going into the lungs, not the space between the lungs and the body wall. So that space has to be airtight. Now each lung is enclosed by a double layered serous membrane. Now serous is a membrane which is secreting watery fluid, and those serous membranes are the pleural membranes. Outer is parietal pleura, which lines the wall of the thoracic cavity, and the inner one is the visceral pleura. So here we can see that the lung is covered by these pleural membranes, which are two of them, parietal outer and inner visceral. Now in between these two pleural membranes there is a cavity, and that is called the pleural cavity. And this pleural cavity is filled with a fine layer of lubricating fluid, which is called pleural fluid. Now the left lung is a slightly smaller because there is a cardiac notch where the heart lies, and it has two lobes. So here the lungs are divided into lobes. The left lung is divided into two lobes, while the right lung is divided into three lobes. The left lung has the two lobes which are named superior and inferior, which are separated by a fissure, and that is named oblique fissure. Right lung, as we mentioned, has three lobes, superior, median and inferior. So there will be two fissures, that is horizontal and oblique fissures. Now let us see these structures by the help of a diagram. So here we have the entire human respiratory system, in which the upper part we have already mentioned, but we can mention here once again, this is the nasal chamber. Then this is the trachea. Now this entire space here, this is the thoracic cavity, and this thoracic cavity has the vertebral column at the back, and here in the front there is a bone, that is the sternum, the breastbone, and to this sternum the ribs are attached. Now in this diagram the ribs have been cut and we can see those cut ends. So here this is the rib, and that is the cut end, and between two ribs there are muscles which we will be discussing. Those are called intercostal muscles. And here the pleural membrane also has been cut open to show the lungs. So this outer layer, this is the pleural membrane. Now the thoracic cavity, it ends with, or at the base we can see there is a muscular structure, and this muscular structure is the diaphragm. And here this notch that we see, this one is the cardiac notch. and these are the fissures. This one which is going straight, so this one would be the horizontal fissure. While this one is the oblique fissure. And accordingly, this would be the superior lobe, this would be the median, and this tiny one here, this is going to be the inferior lobe. And so what is this side? This side is the right side. So this is the right lung, or we can just mention here that this is the right side and this is left side. And as we can see, the left lung has to make a space for the heart, and that is why the left lung is slightly smaller. And the entire structure of the lung, if we see, it is cone shaped, and this conical end here, this one is called the apex. This is the apex, and the end which is resting on the diaphragm, this one is called base. So these are apex and base for both the lungs, of course, and as we can see, the lungs are protected within the rib cage, and rib cage is formed by the sternum on the ventral side, and then the ribs which are going from the ventral side till the back, where they are joining with our vertebral column, with the thoracic vertebrae. Now after going through this structure, let us first see the entire passage now, the respiratory passage. As we have seen, the air will be taken in through the external nostrils and they will be travelling through the nasal cavity and pharynx, then larynx, and then finally the trachea, then it will be going into the lungs. So let us just take up that passage. So here, starting from external nostrils, nasal chamber, internal nostril or the internal nares, then the pharynx, larynx, trachea, then trachea divides into the primary bronchi divide into secondary bronchi. This would be, of course, now inside the lungs. And secondary divides into tertiary then divides into terminal bronchi. And terminal bronchi are then dividing into much thinner structures which are now called bronchioles, lobular bronchioles. Now as we have seen, the lungs are divided into lobes, then each lobe is further divided into lobule. So once it has entered into the lobule part, so that's why the name is lobular bronchiole, and lobular bronchiole then dividing into terminal bronchiole, and these are then opening into respiratory bronchioles which lead into alveolar ducts which are opening into alveolar sacs, and finally where the respiratory exchange takes place, that is the alveoli. Now in this case, air exchange is taking place only just in the smaller part, and that would be the respiratory zone, while the rest of the entire passage is just the conducting zone. So here, from where respiratory bronchioles start, so from respiratory bronchioles till the alveoli, this much is our respiratory zone, while remaining rest of it is the conducting zone. So one point is, important point is this one, that is, where should we take the respiratory zone? So this entire region that is shown in yellow here, this is the respiratory zone. Then as far as the histology of the respiratory tract is mentioned, in case of trachea, we had seen that it is lined by the pseudostratified epithelium and pseudostratified ciliated epithelium, and it had cartilage rings. Now those cartilage rings are present in the primary bronchi also. So till where are those cartilage rings present. So we can just tick those areas where cartilage rings are present. So cartilage rings are present in trachea, they are present in primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, terminal bronchi. That means all the bronchi have cartilage rings, and initial bronchioles. So up till lobular bronchiole also we can tick, which are having cartilage rings. But from terminal bronchiole onwards, the cartilage rings are absent. Now once the cartilage rings are absent, the amount of smooth muscle in the wall becomes more. So there will be more smooth muscle in the wall of the respiratory tract, which is lacking the cartilage ring. So this is one important part. Then all along the respiratory tract, it is not pseudo-stratified epithelium. Rather, as it is becoming thinner and thinner, so there is gradation. So that means it is started with pseudo-stratified epithelium, then later in the middle part it will become columnar, simple columnar with cilia, and then it would be simple cuboidal, and finally from respiratory bronchioles onwards it becomes simple squamous. So usually at the junction where conducting zone is opening into the respiratory zone, that becomes an important part of the question. So that one can remember. So terminal bronchioles, if you get a question, so they are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. And after that, of course, it will become, the cells will become all the more flattened, and that would be simple squamous epithelium. Now let us take a question. When a person breathes air through a tube directly into the trachea, that means there is problem with the upper respiratory tract. The person will have to be cut open so that the air has to be taken directly through the trachea. So it may lead to serious lung crushing and infection due to. So since the upper respiratory tract is not being used, so what was the function of the upper respiratory tract? It was filtering the air, it was humidifying it, and it was conditioning it. So cooling effect, that means the air is not warmed. Drying effect, because it is not being humidified. Non-filtering effect, so that means it is going to be all of these. So here the correct answer is 4. And that is why even if a person breathes through the mouth, then too this kind of problem will arise, because if we are breathing in through the mouth, we are not making use of our nasal cavity, so the air is not being conditioned, it is not being filtered, and it is not properly humidified. Although in the mouth cavity some mucus will certainly cause humidification, but filtering and warming of the air will certainly not take place. Now from here let us move on to the next part, or the region where actual exchange takes place, that is the alveoli. Within the lungs, there are huge number of structures called the alveoli. So if we see the structure of the lungs, and here these microscopic structures which are being enlarged over here, and what we can see, these are the alveoli. So number of alveoli, small sac-like structures, and they are collectively forming the alveolar sac. So in this case, as we see, this is a cup-shaped structure lined by simple squamous epithelium, and it is resting on a basement membrane just like any epithelium. The alveolar sac consists of 2 or more alveoli which share a common opening. So alveolar sac is the larger structure, and one alveolar sac will be having few number of alveoli. The wall of the alveoli, as we said, it is lined by simple squamous epithelium, and these squamous epithelial cells, these can be called pneumocytes, And these pneumocytes are categorized into two types: type 1 pneumocytes and type 2 pneumocytes. Now, type 1 pneumocytes are more numerous and they are the main sites of gaseous exchange. That means through these pneumocytes, oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be exchanged. While type 2 pneumocytes, these are fewer in number and these are secreting surfactant, which is a mixture of phospholipids and lipoproteins, and the phospholipid present in this surfactant is lecithin. So lecithin is one phospholipid which is secreted, and the purpose is to reduce the surface tension. Now, surface tension is the property of moisture or water which tends to reduce the surface area. So these alveoli, they are having a moist inner lining, and this moisture, if it was pure moisture, and when we have exhaled out air, what would have happened? This moisture will tend to bring the walls closer so that it acquires a very small size. And in that case, what would have happened? The alveoli would have collapsed. If there is no surfactant, then when we exhale air, the alveoli would collapse. And that collapse of alveoli is called atelectasis. This is collapse of alveoli. And to prevent this collapse, the alveolar lining is not having pure moisture but some surfactant mixed in it. And this surfactant has detergent-like property, that means it is reducing surface tension so that even when we exhale air, the air pressure inside the alveoli decreases, then too they won't collapse. And in case of smokers, the amount of surfactant secreted becomes lesser and there are greater chances of collapse. Now, the total number of alveoli that we have, that is around 300 million in the two lungs together, and these alveoli, other than the pneumocytes, that is the simple squamous epithelial cells, they are also having some macrophages, and macrophages here are also called dust cells. Now, when we inhale air, the larger particulate matter that is trapped in the nasal cavity itself, that is stopped from going into the lungs in the nasal cavity itself. Very finer particles will be going into the tracheal passage where the mucus will trap it, and the cilia which are lining the tracheal lining, the pseudostratified ciliated epithelium, that is continuously moving outward. It is forming a mucus escalator so that those particles along with mucus, it is pushed outward into the pharynx where we keep on swallowing it. However, very, very fine particles, they cannot be stopped even in the conducting zone, and they would be reaching to the alveoli, and there the macrophages will then finally trap them. So this is how the alveoli are. Now, alveoli are the site where the exchange is going to take place between the blood vessels and of course the alveolar lining, which combined is forming the respiratory membrane. And as we mentioned, we have nearly 300 million alveoli in the two lungs together. And the surface area is 80 square meters, which is nearly the area of the tennis court, the lawn tennis court. So you can imagine the large surface area that we are having inside our chest cavity where air exchange is taking place. Now, if we talk about this respiratory membrane, now here you can see this is the alveolus, and surrounding it there are the blood capillaries. Now in this case, the alveolar epithelium, which we mentioned is the simple squamous epithelium. Then below it there would be a basement substance, as well as there is basement substance in the capillary endothelium also, and here we have the capillary endothelium. Now the capillary endothelium is also simple squamous epithelium, And these three layers together, that means alveolar epithelium plus the basement substance plus the capillary endothelium, these three layers together is having a thickness of 0.2 to 0.5 micrometers. And it has to be very thin, then only simple diffusion can take place. If this respiratory membrane becomes thicker, the diffusion rate will become less. So it is inverse proportionality. We can see thinner the respiratory membrane, higher would be the rate of diffusion. Now let us take up a question related to human respiratory system. So here, what is the function of respiratory part of the human respiratory system? Now respiratory part is meant for exchange of gases. Let us see the options. It clears the incoming air from foreign particles. This is conducting zone, or the nasal cavity is doing this function. It brings the temperature of air up to the body temperature, that is again in the conditioning zone of the nasal cavity. It transports the atmospheric air, that is the entire bronchial tree is doing that. It exchanges O2 and CO2 between blood and atmospheric air. Now this is the correct choice. So here our answer is option 4. Now let us take one more question. In lungs, the air is separated from the venous blood through. So we have just now studied the structure of the respiratory membrane. So it is the respiratory membrane which is separating the air from the blood. So transitional epithelium. Now transitional epithelium is a special epithelium which is associated just with the urinary system. So we needn't read this option further because this cannot be part of the respiratory system. Now squamous epithelium of the alveoli plus the endothelium of the blood vessels. Now this is correct, but let us review the other options as well. Squamous epithelium of alveoli plus cubical epithelium of blood vessel. Now this is wrong because capillaries are lined by simple squamous epithelium which is called endothelium here. Cubical epithelium of alveoli, that is again incorrect because it is simple squamous epithelium. So we have seen that the correct answer is option 2. Now that brings us to the end of today's class, where the human respiratory system, respiratory organs of other animals. Now in the next class we will be discussing how this exchange of gases does take place. That's all for now. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching.